Good morning, everyone. We are just about to get started. I'm going to give it one more minute for people to log on. In the meantime, hope you're all enjoying this nice Friday. Okay, it looks like we've got most people on. Welcome. Welcome to this webinar about how to build a rain garden. We are happy to think about spring today, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of these beautiful pictures of flowers. We've got about 75 people on the call right now. Just so you know, there's a couple of functions here that you can use to interact with us. One is the chat bar down here at the bottom. You can use that to ask questions or make comments. You can also raise your hand. Oh, somebody says they have no sound. Is everybody else hearing me?
You're coming through to me, Corey. Looks like Eileen's answering as well.
Okay, all right, great. So I'm not sure why you're not hearing any sounds, but let me check here.
Sometimes
on my end.
Okay. Sometimes you may need to put on headphones or something. I've found that just occasionally the speakers, don't work. So I don't know if you have any headphones around you could plug in. That might help.
Okay, so it seems like everybody else can hear me. I don't have any headphones right nearby, so I'm just going to proceed. Okay, well, thanks for attending this workshop. My name is Corey Miles. I work for the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. We've been offering these workshops in the region for probably going on 10 years now. And the reason is because rain gardens are very effective at helping to control stormwater runoff. And the reason we want to control stormwater runoff is because it's actually one of the leading causes of pollution in our local waterways. In fact, increased development has made stormwater runoff one of the fastest growing sources of pollution in the Chesapeake Bay. When it rains on natural areas, the water is slowed down and the water is allowed to infiltrate back into the soil. But when it falls on an impervious surface, like what you see here on a roadway, it rushes rapidly off and directly into a storm drain. And along the way, it could pick up pollution such as fertilizer, pesticides, yard waste, anything that's on the surface of the road, motor oil, and it delivers these pollutants directly into our streams and eventually into the Chesapeake Bay. So the main objective of this program is to teach you how to develop and maintain a sustainable landscape to help control stormwater runoff and have a positive impact on the environment. A rain garden is a depressed area in the landscape, kind of like a bowl that collects water from a roof, driveway, or street and allows it to soak into the ground. The plants, mulch, and soil work together to prevent the water from running off and infiltrating and capture it and help it to infiltrate into the ground. So like I said, it helps to keep our local waterways clean and ultimately help to clean up the Chesapeake Bay. By soaking runoff into the ground, rain gardens also help to recharge the groundwater. And if you use native plants, it really helps to beautify your landscape and provide habitat for pollinators and hummingbirds. And the shallow depression of the garden holds back the water to allow it to more effectively infiltrate back into the soil. And many pollutants that are captured in the soil break down over time. When you're building a rain garden or thinking about building a rain garden, you got to think of it as any garden project. There are planning and measurements that need to be taken in order to achieve good function and form. The main parts of your rain garden include an inflow and outflow portion, so you have to get water into your garden, a ponding area on top where the water can collect and slowly infiltrate. You use plants. We recommend to use plants that are native to the region that you live in. And then you put mulch or compost thickly around the plants. And below the mulch, you can have the native soil, or you can amend the soil to be more porous. And then you have a berm to prevent the water from just immediately running out. And then in difficult situations, you might want to install a gravel bed or an under drain, but these are very specific situations. And when you're bringing runoff into your garden, you want to allow safe passage of extra runoff out of your garden, which is called the outflow. So you're going to use the inflow to bring water into your garden and the outflow to let some escape. For the inflow, you can get very creative. You can use your gutters to bring the water in. You can use a road. So you see on the bottom picture, they just have like a curb cut in the road. And the shape of the rain garden works well when it's kind of shaped like a kidney bean. So this allows the garden to accept a wide sheet flow and consolidate it into the garden base. And you know, this is your garden. You can get creative with the inflow. Many people choose to do these rain chains or buckets. They're very beautiful and unique. And the ponding area is the storage space on top. And its depth varies from 6 to 12 inches. And everybody, you know, the first reaction is, what about creating, you know, mosquito breeding habitat? Well, if it's created correctly, your water will drain out in about 24 hours, which mosquitoes need about 5 days of water to hatch eggs, and the water needs to stay stagnant for that time period. So if you have properly amended your soil, you should not be keeping your water ponded for very long and not creating mosquito habitat. So to make sure you don't create a mosquito habitat, sometimes you've got to amend the soil. And what you need to do, and Maria will talk about this, is do an infiltration test to see how easily the water can be absorbed into your soil. So sometimes you need to add a little bit of sand or some compost to make it more porous. But you know, at the very least, you should at least loosen it up. So you want to have loosened soil from about 1 to 2.5 feet deep. And then, you know, Maria will talk about certain situations where you might want to put in gravel and an under drain to have more capacity to hold more water. And now I'm going to give this show over to Maria. Maria Harwood is the conservation scientist over at the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. And she is going to provide the technical overview of the details here. And Maria, the show is yours.
All right, thanks, Corey. Let me try and get everybody on the right screen here. Just a moment. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Where is... Let me try this again.
There you go.
Okay, so we're on the slideshow screens.
Yes, you are.
Okay,
Yep.
great.
Go ahead.
If I close this, let's see. Let me try and hide this. Okay. Thanks, Corey, for the wonderful introduction. A little bit of background about what rain gardens are. She said, my name is Maria Harwood. I work at the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. Today, we're focusing on rain gardens primarily in the Northern Virginia area. We might have folks tuning in from different areas around the state or even greater Mid-Atlantic area. A bunch of the links that I am going to talk about are very detailed to our local geography and some of the plants we talk about as well, using native plants. Eileen will talk about some of those, but again, native to our Northern Virginia area, as well as some of the mapping software for Fairfax County. So that's a little bit of the background, and just a reminder, the session is being recorded. So if you need to review something or something wasn't clear, we will share that afterwards, but always will entertain questions at the end. I've got quite a few slides to go through, and then we'll jump into some questions if there's any clarification needed on my slides. But right now we're going to dive into the nitty-gritty of the design and construction of rain gardens. Again, these rain gardens that we're talking about today are at a residential scale, so they're going to be smaller size. They're not done for any sort of regulatory requirement. Say if you're building a new home, for example, or if there's a new subdivision that goes in or something like that, there could be stormwater requirements. These we're really just talking about a do-it-yourself scale for a homeowner in the backyard. So just to make that clarification up front. See if I can advance my slides. Give me a second here. Let's go. All right. So what I'm going through right now, the slides are based off of this PDF we have on NVSWCD's website. It's a 22-page rain garden design and construction guide. So if the PowerPoint format or listening through the webinar is not a great format for you to learn from, I really encourage you to go, if you just type in your favorite search engine, our acronym NVSWCD, Rain Garden, it will be the first link that pops up. Again, this PDF, great 22-page guide, all about the design and construction, really boils into it. So all of this detail is in there, but just to have that as another backup reference. And on NVRC's website for rain gardens, we have numerous links. We have copies of the slides from these slideshows and many of the links that we're talking about today. So that's another wonderful resource. I believe we'll send around some as a follow-up as well. So again, a word about terminology. We talked about how the rain gardens we're going to be discussing today are that homeowner size scale, so smaller, not regulatory requirements. So you might also hear a term bioretention used. Those are similar to rain gardens. It's just sort of a big brother, big sister. So a larger sized practice that are typically deeper. They have some of those features that Corey talked about that might be optional for us as just a do-it-yourself homeowner, like an under drain or a gravel bed, but those would definitely be a part of those larger bioretentions. They're meant to take a lot more water. So when new subdivisions get built to follow stormwater management regulations and requirements, stormwater management features such as bioretentions are often installed. So, and of course, they're larger and there's more costly, and there's typically permits involved. So you're here, you want to learn about rain gardens, what they are, and hopefully we've got you hooked enough that you want to go ahead and start planning to install your own rain garden. How are we going to go about that? First, we're going to talk about why do you want to build a rain garden? As Corey talked about, it's a great stormwater management tool to filter pollution out of our stormwater runoff. So the water during rainfalls that falls on our roofs, our sidewalks, our roadways, all carry any pollutants that might be deposited or that have fallen on those hard surfaces. Also, what washes off of our slopes as well, even if they are vegetated or if they have turf cover. If they are sloped, say if maybe we accidentally applied excess fertilizer or other soil amendments, those could easily wash off of slopes as well. So maybe you want to build a rain garden to manage some of the stormwater or the runoff from your roof to filter those pollutants. Maybe it's to fix a drainage and erosion problem. Maybe the runoff is really great and it's impeding or it's having some negative effects on your property, so you want to learn how to manage it. Using a rain garden is a great way to capture that stormwater runoff, let it soak into the groundwater, instead of having it run off our surfaces and go into our storm drainage systems, our curb and gutters, and all those other things that just go straight into the streams like Corey talked about. Learning where on your property might be appropriate to place the rain garden is really important in our planning step. We're going to check to see if the location that we think we want to put it in is suitable. So making sure that the soils infiltrate, as Corey talked about. We will have more slides on what that means. Sizing the rain garden is a really important step as well. We want to make sure we make it big enough to capture the amount of water that we're sending to it through our gutters or our downspouts or other hard surfaces like our driveway. And we'll talk a little bit about the materials that are needed and how much of it to make a rain garden, and then the tools that might be needed to construct it, and a little bit about estimating the costs. All right, so how do I know where might be a good spot on my yard, my property to have a rain garden? How can I choose the right location? These couple images here on the slide are just to demonstrate that rain gardens can really be added into an already existing landscape or landscape beds, foundation plantings, pretty seamlessly if they're done well. So they don't need to be, sometimes we just see people plop them out right in the middle of the lawn and they're pretty visible. Some folks like that look because it's obviously a great teaching tool, so they're highly visible. You can mark it with signs, you can get your garden We have a sustainable garden tour that our organization puts on. Right now it is virtual, but we invite folks to virtually tour around other people's property who have done things like rain barrels and rain gardens, and those are actually on our website right now. So you can look up our sustainable garden tour to tour around some, see what other folks have done, some of them rain gardens included. But just a few photos to show that they can really be incorporated into the landscape quite seamlessly. And Eileen will have some other tips and talk about that as well. So other factors in citing a location for a rain garden. This is an example of a slide of a local homeowner that we assisted. And I'm going to ask really quickly, does my pointer show up if I demonstrate on the slide?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So this is a homeowner's property. She was receiving some stormwater flow runoff from a neighbor and she wanted to deal with it. So we located an area in that flow path where she's getting that heavy flow from her neighbors to install a rain garden. This is a picture of the area after the soil has been prepared, amended with compost and other well-draining things that had some mulch top, and this was the homeowner with her planted rain garden functioning very well. So maybe we want to use a rain garden as a solution to a larger scale drainage and erosion problem we're having, or we are going to talk about using the rain garden just to incorporate stormwater runoff from our lot. So just thinking about our gutters or downspouts, our sidewalks and our driveways, is there a way that we can capture that water? Typically keeping it to one lot, one parcel size scale, it's going to be an adequately sized rain garden. If you're taking more runoff, say from neighbors and other things, those can get pretty large and you might have to size them. You might be more on that bioretention end of things, a larger scale, a little bit more costly. So we're primarily going to be focusing on smaller surface areas, taking less amounts of stormwater runoff just from around your property. So over here, location tips. Do you have enough space for the rain garden? We'll talk about sizing. There's a couple different ways of sizing I'll talk about later on. So that'll give you an idea about how big that rain garden is going to be. So Corey showed us some really fun inflows and overflows. So we have to think about how are we going to get the water to this area where we want to let it soak in. Also, how are we going to get the water out? So the overflow is really important to think about because we want to make sure it's not directed in a way going towards a foundation, another neighbor's property, or any place where it's going to do damage or harm. Because there will always be a larger storm than our rain garden is designed to capture. So we have to think about that carefully. Where are we sending that excess runoff? Typically, it's more handy to keep it closer to the source of runoff, closer to that downspout or the hard surface, just for some design considerations and some costs. You don't need to run as much pipe, maybe underground to a farther away location, but if your suitable location is further away, maybe due to soils or just other site conflicts, that's okay as well. It just might be a little bit more cost to make sure you can get that stormwater over there. Keeping a setback or making sure your rain garden is not very close to your home, especially if you have a subgrade structure or something like a basement, really keeping at least 10 feet away from your basement. And that's important because these rain gardens were, again, sending lots of stormwater runoff, lots of rain flow and water to them, and we're letting it soak into the ground and the soil is going to soak it up and it's going to recharge your groundwater table. So as it's soaking in that water, we want to make sure we're not close to something like a basement because the soil acts as a wonderful sponge. And so we don't want to be causing any foundation issues or basements, other things. Utilities and easements are other things to look out for. Typically, a lot of these things are denoted on your plat. Of course, before you ever dig, always call Miss Utility to get, if you're not familiar with where the locations of buried utilities are in your lot, that's a great first step. Avoiding easements. Apologies for the long, sort of messy link here, but we will work to get these posted later so you can click on them, or but if you just do in your search engine Fairfax County Interactive Map Gallery and the Stormwater Infrastructure Map, that's this link, which shows some locations of the stormwater infrastructure in Fairfax County in Virginia. So those are things like the underground buried pipes that are carrying the stormwater runoff, large volumes of it. Your easements are going to be mapped most accurately on your plat. So the easements are not denoted on the stormwater infrastructure map, but you can use it as a tool. If there is some sort of infrastructure on your property, there's probably an easement that goes along with it. But again, those would be noted on your plat. Just a few of the pictures to talk about keeping the rain garden closer to those hard surfaces, the driveway, the roof. You'll see this image again later as we talk about calculations. Another great example of a rain garden pretty close to this downspout right here, taking that stormwater. And the stormwater infrastructure map that I just talked about, those networks of pipes underground. This actually, those red areas do show those stormwater easements, but in the tool currently, you would just see the lines, you wouldn't see the easements. Again, check on your plat for the most adequate, most accurate, marking. More location tips. So rain gardens, we want them to be flat landscape depressions because we want them to hold that water and let it soak in slowly over time. So you can build rain gardens on slopes, moderate slopes. We're going to say avoid steep slopes just because there's additional engineering that has to be done because we do really want a flat area. So you have to build up a larger berm or even a retaining wall on the back downslope side just to get that flat area for the water to soak into. Avoiding conflicts under big trees because trees do wonderful treatment of stormwater for us. So we really want to leave the trees alone. The larger the tree, the more susceptible usually they are to disturbance, like digging around their shallow root system. So giving trees their space, trying not to dig a lot intensively underneath them. So avoiding conflicts of trees. A very general rule of thumb can be to avoid the drip line of the tree. So that's if you look up, if you're under the canopy and where the extent of the canopy goes, if you kind of look to the ground, that's the drip line. So trying to generally stay out of that area when you're digging. Again, larger trees, that can be a very large canopy and a large area. But for the most part, we want to avoid conflicts with the trees. Fairfax County, we have things called resource protection areas, which are protections along our waterways. These areas have certain legislative restrictions on them about things that we can do, basically because we acknowledge that our streams are very sensitive systems and we want to protect them as best we can and keep them natural, keep them wooded, and not do a lot of disturbance in those areas. Typically, the resource protection areas and the floodplains that are near streams have higher groundwater table, which also makes it unsuitable for siting a rain garden, because a rain garden, we want to let that water soak in. If the water table is already very high, then our rain garden is never going to drain. It's going to stay a puddle or a pond, and that's not what we want to see. So typically these RPAs or areas near streams that are lower lying might not have the well draining types of soils that we need to have a rain garden function properly. We're also going to avoid building close to septic systems or drinking water wells, and avoiding low areas with standing water. So what does that mean? A lot of times people might think that, oh, I've got this low-lying wet spot where the water's collecting in a puddle in my backyard. That would be perfect for a rain garden. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. Seeing that puddle there does denote that it is a lower spot and water is getting there and it's collecting there. It's not draining out, so we know we do have probably a large amount of stormwater runoff getting to that spot. But what that ponding is telling us is that these soils might be highly compacted, not well draining. And that is the opposite of what we want for a rain garden. So we can amend the soils, as we'll talk about later, maybe even swap out the soil that's there for a pre-made mix that can be purchased, or using things like those under drains or gravel layers, but those are all higher costs. So generally, we will look at doing the infiltration test in these areas, but as a cue, if we've got standing water in those spots, maybe let's try and see if there's a spot that's a little bit more uphill from this low-lying area where the stormwater runoff is coming from, and can we put a rain garden or another type of stormwater practice a little bit uphill of this lower lying area, and do we have better draining soils up there before the water finds its way down to this low area with not well draining soil? Do we have the right location? So we talked about setbacks, utility conflicts, calling this utility. Other things, we've been talking a lot about the soil. Is the soil suitable? So we have this information all about soil on our website. I invite everybody to go and read about it, all about the different properties of soil. And it also, I'll have a link on the next slide to the soils viewer, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but here's some examples of a failed rain garden. So this is one that turned into sort of a pond system. The water's getting in there, but it's never properly draining out. So that could be for a number of reasons. The soil wasn't suitable, or maybe issues during construction. But we definitely want to avoid this happening. And so if you take these proper planning steps that we're discussing today, you should be able to avoid the situation as well of a clogged or not well draining rain garden that's just holding that water. We only want to see this ponding for less than 48 hours, and then it should really drain down into the soil underneath. Okay, a little more about soils. This is the soils viewer that I just talked about. Again, for Fairfax County, there's the interactive map gallery, and you can look up soils viewer, and it will give you something that looks a little bit like this. This is going to be a very general, broad overlook. So I do not want you to use this as the only determination when looking at your property to see if the soils are suitable. These maps were done on a very large scale. There was some on-site investigation when these soils maps were created, but they were generally looking at the existing topography of old maps. There was some on-site determination, but definitely not on every single homeowners across Fairfax County when these soil maps were drawn. So you need to do a little bit of your own homework. But again, a first step, you can look at the soils viewer. The soils number corresponds with a name, and there's a characteristic under the soils viewer called suitability for infiltration. So we can see here we've got two different types of soils that potentially have a good suitability for infiltration, and we've got this one over here that is labeled as having a poor suitability for infiltration. Again, this is a broad brushstroke, a first step. This is not an end-all be-all determination for your yard if a rain garden is suitable or not. The next steps that we're going to talk about how do we really know what's going on our property? Well, we do this infiltration test. Again, another link, we have this infiltration test document PDF where you can help go through all of the steps in great detail. It's got a little chart for you to track. Generally, what a soils infiltration test, you want to do it as close to the spot where you think that you want to do the rain garden. It'll be most accurate that way, especially after calling Miss Utility and checking for all of those other conflicts that we talked about. Then you can go ahead and start digging about 1 foot deep hole and about 5 inches wide, I think, at the base. On the slide, we saw a post hole digger. That is a really great tool to make an appropriate type size hole pretty easily. So the infiltration test that we're going to do, it's basically we pre-soak the hole. So we dig this about 1 foot deep hole, fill it up with water. We're going to let it completely drain down before we do our test, and then we're going to start again, and then we're going to fill it up again, and then we're going to do measurements over a couple hours to find the drop, and then we'll calculate our average rates of infiltration. So how many inches per hour do our native soils, the soils we have just on our property already existing, how good are they at soaking up that water? Because that's, again, the whole function of rain gardens. So you did the infiltration test. What do the results mean when you get 1 inch per hour? If it's greater than 1/2 inch per hour, you have pretty well draining soils existing already on your site. So you just need to amend a little bit with compost, as Corey had on one of the slides of somebody with a rototiller sort of loosening up the soils, incorporating that compost. That just makes sure everything is really well draining. Compost also can help the plants establish as well, but just loosening up those soils. But overall, we can use what we have in place. If we have slower infiltration rates, it doesn't mean that we cannot have a rain garden. It just means that they're probably going to be a little bit costlier, and we're going to need to do a few more steps designing them. Whether that is completely removing and replacing the soil. So literally they haul the soil off here that you have, and they bring in an engineered rain garden soil. So these are soils that garden centers have. They're a pre-made mix with certain amounts of sand and soil and other things in a very prescribed proportion to be well draining. So they would actually have to dig it all out, take the soil out, and bring in the new soil. If you have a really slow infiltration rate, it can still be done by replacing the soil, but you're also going to want to put that gravel layer that Corey had on some of her slides and an under drain, which is basically a pipe at the base of the garden. So as that water soaks in, if it's going too slowly, the water, once it reaches that pipe, it's going to drain some of that water out. So you don't have water sitting there for over 48 hours. And that under drain pipe is going to need to discharge somewhere. So it's going to need to have an outlet where it can let that water slowly drain out of. Okay, so what about sizing your rain garden? We're going to get into a little bit of math for these next few slides. I do want you to know that there are many different ways to size your rain garden. We do really recommend that you go ahead and do a little bit of the calculations. I'm going to talk about on the next couple slides a few different ways of sizing. There is also this tool I wanted everybody to be aware of. It's put out by the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay. And if you look up their yard design tool, they have this yard design tool. It's not only for rain gardens, but it's also for conservation landscaping. So those are areas of native plants. So it's a really great click-through tool. It has a lot of the same things we talked about: citing your rain garden, utility conflicts, easements, and then they will help you do the calculations as well to appropriately size the rain garden. So that's just another great tool out there. Why do we want to size the rain garden? We want to make sure we're getting it the appropriate amount of water. So if we're sending too much stormwater to it, too many downspouts, then it might be overwhelmed and it's just going to be overflowing all the time. It can't handle the amount of water we're sending to it. Or if we made a rain garden too big and we're sending too little water there, that's sort of a wasted potential a little bit. So maybe you can add more downspouts. So if we do a little bit of the homework before we start to try and get the appropriate depth and ponding and doing the sizing, you can certainly go out, do an infiltration test if the soils are adequate, try and route a downspout to that area and watch how it goes and see if you think it's performing well, if you do want to skip the sizing steps. But again, we're going to go through the sizing. All right, so how much impervious area or how much hard surfaces are we going to be sending to the rain garden? Then we'll use that to determine the volume of runoff that needs to be captured in our rain garden. The ponding depth, as Corey had on some of her slides, it's that area on top of the rain garden. Rain gardens are landscaped depressions, so they're bowl-shaped areas. So they're going to hold water on the top. That's that ponding depth. So it could be just 6 inches deep, it could be 12, a foot, it can be more with that ponding depth, but you can make it deeper or shallower to your taste or the size that you have. If you're going to make it shallower, you might need a larger footprint to take the amount of water you're going to it. Or if you make it deeper, you can maybe shrink it. So that might be some constraints you have on your property that you might need, or you could make it bigger or a smaller footprint. Okay, again, the roof, the driveway, those are hard or impervious surfaces that are going to this rain garden here. The lawn is a pervious surface, but we're also going to calculate how much lawn is going. So here's an example schematic. We're going to take an example of half of the roof here. We're saying that the majority of the driveway as well as the lawn is going to, we're looking at this rain garden over here. If you have, to do the sizing, if you have your plat, often you can use that. If you have another mapping software for Fairfax County, they have a public mapping tool called JADE. So they have some calculators. You can click around on areas using aerial imagery to get a rough approximation. I think you can also use tools like Google Earth to do a similar calculation footprint. But estimating here for the driveway and the roof area, so all told, all of that hard surface impervious area, we've got 2750, and we're doing this in square feet. So the runoff volume, we're going to calculate the total of those hard surfaces times the rainfall. So we're going to be sizing our rain garden today. We're talking about them holding 1 inch of rainfall. And why are we selecting 1 inch of rainfall? So in our area in Northern Virginia, approximately 90% of our storm events, of our rain events, are going to be 1 inch or less in size. So if we're sizing to a 1 inch storm, so a 1 inch amount of rainfall, we're going to be capturing a large amount of the majority of the storms. But again, there will always be a larger storm, which is why we talk about overflows and where is that excess water going to go. The lawn area we're also going to calculate because, again, this is a bit of a slope here, and although it's not as much water is going to leave the lawn area as our hard roofs, still some water will be shed or will run off of our softer surfaces. This is a schematic again. Corey showed us a little bit at the beginning, but again, this ponding area is this depth where that's going to be holding the water that we're sending to it. A little bit of mulch is great, and this is either amended soil with just the rototilled and compost, or if we did have to do a remove and replace. But the water's coming in one area and going out the other, the inflow and the overflow. Sizing your rain garden. The ponding depth, as we just saw on the previous slide, I said before it could be 6 inches, it could be 1 foot, it could be greater. Here for ease, again, we're using this 1 inch rainstorm event, and ponding depth, for simple, we are using 1 foot in our calculations. So here's a little bit for the surface area from the impervious, the hard surfaces. It's going to account to 220 square feet surface area, plus 4 square feet needed from the softer or the pervious areas. So total about 224 square feet of rain garden surface areas needed to capture all of this water that we are sending to it if we have about a 1 foot depth on top. Again, this amount is 1 depth. This is a sizing worksheet. At the very start, I talked about that PDF guide that we have, the 22-page guide. It's got the sizing worksheet in there, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. That resource is there, and you'll have these slides afterwards. I also discussed how there are different ways to size. If you didn't want to do all of that intricate math, these are 2 different tables you can use to very roughly size your rain garden. So we have those different depths, 6 inches, 9 inches, or a foot of ponding depth. How deep is it going to be? And then approximately take those different areas either from the pervious, so those lawn areas, or those impervious, those roof and driveway areas. And then these figures here are the surface area that we need of a rain garden to approximately capture that amount of runoff from an impervious area at these different depths. So this is a handy table that you can use to do rough calculations if you didn't want to go through all the steps on the previous slide. And then again, there was the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay tool I just talked about. Okay, so we know where we're going to put the rain garden. We know if our soils can handle it or handle the water we want to send to it or not. We know the size. So what's next? We need to estimate a number of factors because we're ready to build. So the total rain garden depth, excavation volume, mulch, compost, amended soil, gravel, plants, and if we are doing this piped under drain on a rock layer, for the inflow and overflow, depending on how it's designed, you can use a little bit of rock material to stabilize those areas. Again, some of the common tools that we might need to build our rain garden. And this is, again, sort of the do-it-yourself option. These are very rough calculations on this page to give you an idea of potentially the costs. Again, they vary widely based on your area, where you are. So these costs are very approximate, but this might give you a little bit of an idea about the amount of soil that you're going to need to be either amending and just bringing in some compost, or if you have to remove, and replace should you need to excavate out the soil and bring in a mix. Okay, so we're ready for the build day. Again, rain gardens function on flat surfaces. They rely on those flat surfaces to hold and retain that water. So we do really want to level out the rain garden as best as we can. This has sort of an organic shape around it, but generally we're going to use kind of this core area as the flat area because we do have that ponding depth. So remember, this is going to be a sunken in area. We are going to need to have a bit of a slope on the sides, so that'll take up a little bit of the area. So excavating out the surface to the appropriate depth that you've calculated. If you're using a sod cutting tool or whatever method you're using to remove the turf. You can also use small scale machinery if needed, if you're renting, to help that excavation go a little bit smoother. So once you've got the soil excavated out and again, the flat surface to work on, you can amend the soil if you're using your native soils in place, adding in that compost to help it be freer, more well draining. So here's a rototiller working in that compost, that soil amendment. Sorry, I'm not sure. Is it going to advance? Okay, I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry about that. Again, a flat area. This rain garden schematic is showing an under drain with a gravel layer at the bottom. So for a homeowner scale, this isn't typically needed, but again, if you don't have well draining soils from that infiltration test, but you still really want to have a rain garden, there are some of these extra steps that you can take to divert the water away. And again, showing kind of the more complex layer scale of the gravel and that under drain pipe that's going in. We talked about really early on, if your ground surface is sloped, you're going to have to do a little bit more engineering to cut in and build up the far side. This can be done a couple different ways, but again, we do want to establish a flat area where that water can soak in with that surface area footprint that we use to calculate from our sizing spreadsheet. A few diagrams, again, these are in the design and construction PDF about constructing on a slope, cutting into the slope and building up the berm on the far side. Here are some rain garden schematics that this has been constructed on the slope. So it was cut in on this side and they sort of used an informal retaining wall with rocks on that far side. So again, if the ground surface is sloped, that retaining wall or that berm on the downhill slide will be a little bit larger as well, or you might have a more formal retaining wall. So on these, they show, again, some of the retaining wall examples. Building a rain garden on a slope can be done just with a little bit more engineering and some terracing. You can also have a raised rain garden depending on your yard or the different challenges you have. You can build up areas to send the water and the runoff to, and then it will drain into the soil beneath. So another way to deal with that slope, again, let's raise up the soil and flatten it out. These steps here, Eileen is going to cover shortly about some inspection and maintenance needs, but Really quickly, after major rain events, after you've established your rain garden, checking the inflow and outflow. Those are areas with concentrated flow, so they might more easily erode. Looking for signs of erosion in and around the rain garden. Are you getting deposits of different colored sediments coming in? See if any plants might have been damaged. Keeping a nice mulch layer on the top of the surface will help suppress the weeds. Removing if there's any debris or sediment in the area, or if we need to repair the inflow or overflow if there was a very large storm event. So again, for Fairfax County, if you're wondering if you need a permit to build a rain garden, there's this Engineer of the Day hotline. This is also a web form that you can fill out to email them, but you can also give them a call if you just wanted to double check if a permit is required before you start building your rain garden. Just a couple slides of really pretty rain gardens in action. So they can really be made and done in various shapes, sizes, plant landscapes, really rather unique to the homeowner's taste. This is sort of the more commercial scale bioretention. I would say it's taking a larger amount of runoff through a curb cut, taking runoff from the street. All right, and finally, just for wrapping up my part with the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District, we have many resources on our website. This is where you can find us. If you also into social media, we have a Facebook that you can find us at. Always, if you ever have any questions, feel free to email us, conservationdistrict@fairfaxcounty.gov. This is a contact form that can be used to email. We also have some different listservs and notifications that go out for various events and publications. So if there are some questions, I don't know if Corey's or anyone has been tracking along. Let me see if I can expand the chat.
Yes, we do have several questions, Maria. Let's see. One thing here that that came up was would an infiltration test also be a tip-off that you have groundwater close to the surface?
Exactly. I think I probably didn't do a great job. I don't know if I had a slide about the groundwater conflicts. So we talked about those lower lying areas with streams like the RPAs and the floodplains that our groundwater table might be higher. So if you are digging a hole, and sometimes if you're digging that hole for your test pit for your infiltration test, sometimes if you have an area of high groundwater, those holes will actually just fill up themselves with water. That's that groundwater table intrusion, that layer of the water that's running underground. That's what feeds our streams and is really vital and important. But if you're, again, lower lying areas near streams, that groundwater table is going to be closer to the surface. So potentially if you're digging down a test pit that's 1 foot or 2 feet deep, and before you even fill it up with any water to do your pre-soak, if you start to see some water filling in that hole, that's how you know that you're intercepting some groundwater. Not if, say you dug the hole and there was a rain event and it filled up with water, but just if you were dug it and started to see some water coming in. That would be an area where you really do not want to install a rain garden because of the conflicts with the groundwater. What we want to have from the base of that amended soil layer, we want to have a couple feet of native soil separation until we get to the groundwater table. That's for a number of reasons. If we're intercepting that groundwater table, our rain garden is never going to drain. It will hold that water and it will pond because we're running into that layer of water in the soil. Another thing, these areas of rain gardens, we're sending sometimes a polluted stormwater runoff to them. So if there is not a couple feet of separation from the bottom of our rain garden to the groundwater table, that soil acts as a great filter to get out those pollutants. So if we don't have an appropriate buffer, the soil cannot filter out those pollutants well enough. So we can potentially run into groundwater contaminant pollution issues. So that's great clarification.
We have another question. Why is the rainfall factor only 0.02 for lawns versus 0.08 for roofs?
That's great. Let me see if I can quickly go back to those slides. So those are factors, those are runoff coefficients. So the roofs, most of the water when it rains that falls on a hard surface, an impervious surface like a roof, a driveway, is going to be generated into runoff. So I think for this runoff coefficient, we actually use the factor of 1. Sometimes stormwater engineers will use a factor of like 0.95 or something. They say not absolutely all the water that's falling on, because sometimes there is evaporation that happens on your roof. But for simplicity, we're estimating that all of the water that's falling on those hard surfaces is getting generated. So I didn't talk, we sort of have these simplified into constants here for you, but I didn't really go into the background. And then pervious surface, less of the water that's coming off of your lawn is going to be generated into stormwater runoff. So that's saying, again, these hard surfaces, nearly 100% of it is going to go as runoff. The lawn areas do have the ability to soak in those natural areas. Again, the soil is a wonderful sponge, can soak up. So the lawn area, a lot less of it. If you look at this, the pervious or these lawn areas. So if we compare impervious to pervious, we can see how much less surface area of a rain garden we're going to need, because that pervious area is generating such little amounts of runoff compared to what's coming straight off of your roof. I hope that clarified a little bit.
That sounds good. Some of the garden photos, here's another question. Some of the garden photos show a high uphill side and a low downhill side, which would allow stormwater to flow directly out into the storm drains during a large storm event. These do not look like great examples of design unless I am missing something. Could you please clarify on that?
Yeah, some of the examples of stormwater. So you can think about that from a couple different ways. Let me see if I can get a picture of stormwater, one of the rain gardens that had close proximity to the street.
Yeah, it may not be clear the direction the water's coming from, because yeah, this one does look, but is the water coming from the bottom of the picture or the top of the picture, Maria?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure with this. Some of the rain gardens are done closely to the storm drains to capture the overflow. So our rain gardens are capturing water that otherwise all of it would just be running off straight. So we have them designed as sort of a first flush model. So again, we're capturing that 1 inch amount of storm. We do need to send the excess overflow someplace. So having it directed into a storm drainage system is an appropriate place where we're not going to be overflowing it onto our neighbors or yards or basements or flooding other areas. So whereas before that storm drain was existing and it was probably receiving 100% of the runoff that was flowing off to that area, by siting a rain garden close, we're trying to intercept some of the water before it gets to those sensitive storm drain areas. that help a
Okay.
little bit?
Yes.
Eileen, feel free to chime in, or Corey as well.
Sure. Yeah, I think with this picture here, you know, it's a little hard to tell exactly where the inflow and the outflow are. So I would guess maybe, I don't know if water is flowing in actually from this side, or if maybe there's a pipe coming in somewhere.
Yeah,
But
I'm not
because
sure
I
if
don't
it's,
know details.
I would
Yeah,
assume
it may
maybe it's
be coming in
piped
from
into
that.
the bottom and it's
And
overflowing
then
here.
overflows here. Yeah, so it can be, sometimes with the photos, it can be a little deceptive to see the topography and everything.
Yeah.
Okay, another question. Is there a list of plants that would be edible for rain gardens? I don't think we normally recommend putting edible plants in the rain garden.
There's a couple different schools of thought on that, and I don't know, Eileen, do you want to talk? Are you going to cover that, or do you want me to try and?
Well, yeah,
answer?
not specifically. There may be some lists of edible plants. I mean, some of the plants do have berries, you know, the different viburnums, but obviously each plant you'd have to, you know, confirm if they are edible. I know, you know, a few of them, I think beautyberry and, you know, some things like that are edible, but I think because of the pollution filtration aspect, I don't know if you would want to necessarily be focusing on edible plants, you know, for the rain garden. So maybe do some edible plants in some other areas of your yard, but with the rain garden, you know, because of that aspect of it. But I think, you know, it's possible there's a list. I'm not familiar with a list that's focused on edible and rain garden plants per se, but.
Right. Yeah, just because they have that that pollution removal capacity, it's maybe not a good idea to eat the plants that are growing in your rain garden. Here's another question. How do you know how far down you need to amend the soil?
That's a great question. So for the sizing that we talked about for this residential homeowner do-it-yourself, we just talk about sizing using the ponding area, which is that layer on top, that dead space where the water is going to sit and then go in. So there's more complex ways of sizing, like when they do bioretentions and other things, when you have a gravel layer, and then especially if you have an engineered soil mix layer in the middle, you can actually do stormwater calculations to understand how much water is going to be held in that soil and held in that gravel. So you don't just need to size it based on the top. To keep it simple for the rain garden, for a homeowner scale, we just size it to the top, and we say to amend about a foot or two of the soil underneath. So taking a rototiller and loosening it up to about 1.5 feet, I think is maybe what we had on some of the slides. But again, they can be designed more intensively where you're sizing them based on the very specific depth. For this, we keep it really general and just say about 1 to 2 feet. Did Eileen or Corey have anything you want to add to that?
Nope, sounds good.
And also with the test hole, you fill it up once, and then do you do your timed test the second time you fill it with water, or do you do it on the first time?
Great
questions
for clarification. Yeah, the second time. So you do one complete fill up for a pre-soak and let it totally drain out, and then you fill it a second time with water, and then you're going to measure that second time you have it filled. And that fact sheet we had has really great step-by-step how to do an infiltration test.
One more question I think we have time for. Let's see. I have 4 to 5 inches of good topsoil under sod. Should I remove the soil, excavate it to the desired depth, and then put the topsoil back?
So if you have done your infiltration test to about 1 foot deep and you have good infiltration, you can scrape off that turf layer. So just try and take as little of that top soil layer as you want. You can also, if you do use chemical herbicides, you could spray that turf to kill it as well, and then just rototill in some compost amendments. So you're going to want to make sure you've got a little bit of a depression. So that's why using the sod cutter to actually take off kind of that whole sod layer and remove that helps give you that ponding layer depth, and then you can just add in the compost. The compost layer itself, when you rototill, might really make the soil very fluffy, and it will increase in volume pretty quickly. That is going to gradually compact. So all of those big poor open spaces that we had, and the compost gradually is going to break down. So the rain garden over time will depress and sink in a little bit. So if you're worried about once you've amended the soil, added all of that compost, if it's seeming pretty high, you can wait a little bit, and normally you are really going to get the depression happening naturally.
Sorry, I was on mute. I'm gonna pass it over to Eileen now. We still have a few other questions, but I want to make sure we have enough time to hear Eileen's presentation, and I can continue to answer things in the chat box here. So let me change the presenter. Okay, Eileen, you should have control now.
Okay, oops, trying to
see your email.
Sorry.
There we go. Now we see PowerPoint.
Okay.
We see your notes.
Okay. We're good?
There you go. You're good to go.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, sorry. Oopsie. Did I just, no. Can you still see it? Oh, no. Can you hear me okay? Sorry.
I've got,
yes.
I can hear you and I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. I just lost my view of the PowerPoint though, so just a moment. I don't know what happened here. There we go. Okay, sorry about that. Just got the wrong windows on top here. So anyway, thanks everyone for joining us today. And so we've got some fun stuff to talk about now in terms of planting and maintaining your rain garden after you've done a lot of good work in terms of finding a good location and doing your digging and your soil amendment and getting everything laid out. So we've got a lot of great choices we can make on fun plants, and this is a great time to think about plants. With it being so cold and wintry out, it's fun to dream about our springtime gardens. So one of the important questions about rain gardens, sometimes people think about them as like a pond. You know, are rain gardens wet? Is it like a pond? And it's not the same as a pond in that it's not wet all the time. So rain gardens are wet some of the time, you know, immediately after those storm events when they fill up with water, but then the water drains down. And, you know, as Maria mentioned, we don't want water standing in there for more than a day or so. So the plants that are in the rain garden need to be suited for wet and dry conditions. So you're not necessarily going to be thinking of wetland plants, but you're thinking of the types of plants that, you know, naturally would occur along stream banks and floodplain areas where they get wet some of the time, but would not be in kind of a full inundated wetland environment. So one way that's helpful to think about, think about a rain garden is similar to like a puddle. You know, if you see a puddle on the sidewalk, as it dries out, you know, first it starts drying out more from the edges and then kind of gradually down towards the middle. You know, the lowest point of the puddle is the point that gets, you know, that dries out last. So with thinking about your types of plants, you want to put your most aquatic plants kind of in the middle and the deepest point, And then the more emergent plants and edge plants are the ones that can handle, a little bit more drier conditions. The ones in the middle, can handle some more inundation and having, a little bit more of those wet feet, for potentially a day or so. So again, here's just another graphic, again, showing kind of the side and then also the top view with the different zones of the rain garden. So you have water flowing in from the left side here and then to the right. And so the plants in the lowest portion of the rain garden, do need to be okay with having some of that inundation and standing water around them. So some of the things like juncus and some of the irises and those types of plants can handle that. Cardinal flower, a lot of those wetlands, or floodplain plants, can handle those conditions. Plants on the side slopes, can handle some occasional standing water for shorter amounts of time. And then as you get kind of into the edges of the rain garden, those ones, could be maybe the ones that don't necessarily have to be as comfortable with wet feet, but can tolerate a little bit of those kind of conditions. So with building the rain garden, I think Maria may have talked about this a little bit when you kind of set up your rain garden area before you jump into planting. We do often recommend doing some testing. Well, this is a pretty big rain garden here, but you can imagine this on a smaller scale for a homeowner rain garden. And you can, create the area and then just leave it open until a rainstorm comes, or you can even create a rainstorm by flowing some water into it with your hose and just see how the water spreads around in there and kind of look and see where your areas are, your wetter areas and drier areas, and just look, even though you are trying to make the bottom of the rain garden pretty flat, you will have, some areas that will dry out a little bit faster than other locations. Another key point for thinking of your plants and doing your planting design is that there are some locations in the rain garden that may have a little bit more higher energy of flow. And so particularly the area near the inlet where the water, if you have a downspout or something, where you've got a little bit more concentrated flow coming into the rain garden, in that location, you're going to want to have sturdier plants. So again, things like potentially juncus or blue flag iris, some of the sedges, some things like that can sort of lay flat maybe a little bit, if there's a bigger storm, and then kind of pop back up. So those, again, and that's if you have more of a concentrated source coming in. If you have more of overland flow or sort of flow coming from your whole yard area and not one specific point coming in, that may not be as critical. The flow will be spread out a little bit more, but that is something to think about for your planting location in the garden. So here's an example. This is one of our county rain gardens on Albemarle Street, but you can see here at the inlet, we have some of the grasses there that, again, help kind of break up the energy of that flow as it sort of comes right into the rain garden and help it slow down and spread out a little bit. Now you also, depending on the location of your rain garden, there can be, as we were talking about with the edible plants, there can be different pollutants that get into the rain garden. So obviously, some pollutants that we're trying to reduce are some of the nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, which are obviously those are food for plants, so they're not necessarily bad for plants, but we do want to try to reduce, those in terms of being able to flow off into the storm drain system, because those do have a negative impact when they get out to our streams and the Chesapeake Bay, because they can cause, algal blooms and low oxygen conditions. But they're not necessarily negative for plants, obviously, because those are plant nutrients. If you have a rain garden, if you're planting a rain garden near your driveway or adjacent to the road, like the one in the photo here, you may have salt that's going to be getting in the rain garden. So that would be something to think about, again, with your plant selection. There may also be some heavy metals or, fluids from cars, again, if you have it next to a driveway or a roadway. And then also pesticides and herbicides if those are used in the area near the rain garden. So all things to think about in terms of your plant choice. Now, we definitely encourage people to use native plants in their rain garden. And so as Maria mentioned, we have a lot of information here for the Northern Virginia area, but if you're in a different location, there should be some good native plant information for your area as well. If you have any difficulty finding that, we're happy to help try to point you in the direction there. But the benefits of native plants, there's quite a few. They're adapted to your local conditions, the soils and the precipitation. And so really once you get them established, they don't need a lot of hand holding or any kind of special treatment. I have a lot of native plants in my yard. And again, once you get past that first 6 months to a year where they're well established, they put down very deep roots. And so they can survive, all different kinds of conditions, even when you have, more of a drought condition. And those deep roots are also part of what helps the rain garden function and do a lot of its work because the deep-rooted plants, create little channels for the water to help infiltrate into the ground. And so they're helping kind of keep the soil loose and letting the water soak in. So they do, over time, they save you time and money. Once you get them established, you don't have to be spending a lot of time, putting on treatment or anything like that to keep them thriving. And they also are wonderful in terms of supporting our local, birds and insects. You can see here, this is the type of milkweed. You got a monarch caterpillar growing on there. So that's great. I have some of the common milkweed in my front yard, and we typically get monarchs on every year, and my kids love it. And this past year we had huge numbers of caterpillars on our milkweed, and the whole neighborhood, all the neighborhood kids were coming over to see the caterpillars and the butterflies. So it's just a wonderful. It can be a wonderful hobby for everyone in your family. And if maybe you're not into insects, but if you like bird watching, the birds rely on a lot of these caterpillars and other things, for their food sources. So it's all, part of our food web. So, and there are a lot of different beautiful types. So we'll have some more examples of good rain garden plants coming up. So we definitely want to encourage everyone to avoid invasive plants as well. And so these invasive non-native plants, are species that were typically introduced by humans, for various reasons. A lot of times because they were fast growing, we might have brought them in to help revegetate an area or, for some other purposes. But because they're not part of the local ecosystem, they don't typically have anything, that feeds on them. The birds and the local insects, do not, see them as any kind of a food source, and they can really kind of interfere with the local ecosystem processes. And there are definitely a lot of maintenance work. Probably a lot of folks have challenges with English ivy. It's a very common one that people brought in because, it does grow in the shade. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, nothing else will grow in the shade, but, that's definitely not true. I have a more of a shady backyard, and we took out a lot of English ivy when we moved in, and there's a lot of great shrubs and plants and things that that do well in the shade, or the partial shade. So definitely do not cause more trouble for yourself by bringing in the invasives, because it'll just be a lot of extra work. So some good rain garden plants. This is a fun one. This is the winterberry holly. And it has these wonderful red berries in the winter, and the birds really love to feed on them. And you can see you also get some nice fall color with the leaves there, with the nice yellow leaves. And so this is a plant where you need to have a male and a female in order to get berries. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to plant some of the winter berries. Just make sure you get. It doesn't have to be, even if there's another one, I think in the nearby area, that would work. It doesn't necessarily have to be in your yard, but if you want to be guaranteed, it's good to get, a male and a female. Another great rain garden plant is the Virginia sweet spire. This is also good, even just if you have areas with, drainage issues or some, excess water, things like that. And so it has sort of these nice white tassel flowers in the spring. And then you can see the red fall color. And there are a couple different sizes of this. I think the general species is probably up to 6 feet, but there is a slightly smaller cultivar if you maybe don't have space, kind of for the larger version. But and this is one, again, I have this one in my backyard, and it does well in the part sun, part shade conditions. Some other nice berry plants. We have black chokeberry and then also the red chokeberry. And these are, again, kind of good, a little bit larger shrubs that do well in rain garden conditions. And you can see you have obviously the nice berries to help support wildlife and some, good color throughout the season. So that's one thing to think about when you're choosing your plants is, different season interest. So, it's a lot of them have the spring flowers or berries or fall colors. So it's good to think about having that, so you don't have everything potentially blooming in the spring. You can have things blooming at different times of the year. There's a lot of really nice viburnums as well that do well in rain garden conditions. And so we have the arrowwood viburnum here and the possum haw viburnum. I also have a maple leaf viburnum in my backyard that was just ended up being a volunteer, but that's a nice one to have as well. Black-eyed Susans are a great plant, again, for rain gardens, and this would be potentially something nice you could plant like along the edge or maybe in the front part, if you want to have sort of some lower plants and then arcing up to some of the taller size plants. So these are very adaptable to a lot of different conditions. The Joe Pye weed, there's a couple types of Joe Pye weeds, but these are wonderful plants as well. They can be, I think the standard species is fairly tall. It can, be up to 6 to 8 feet tall. And then there are some slightly shorter cultivars for that as well. And these ones are wonderful, especially if you like butterflies. These are definitely pollinator magnets. They are usually covered with bees and butterflies. So I've had Joe Pye weeds in my yard for quite a while and just enjoyed, taking pictures of all the butterflies that like to come and visit them. So these are a great substitute for butterfly bush. A lot of people, which is a non-native, have the butterfly bush, but this is actually a great native substitute for that as a non-native. Then we have the mountain mint, and there's the narrowleaf mountain mint and also the short tooth mountain mint, and these do really well, again, in rain garden conditions. So the narrowleaf mountain mint is more of a small plant. The short tooth mountain mint is more of a 3 to 4 foot tall. And these do actually have a nice minty smell. You can even smell it, when you're sort of near the plant, which is kind of nice. But definitely, if you rip off a piece of the leaf, you can enjoy some of the mint smell. But they do have a nice, nice fragrance when you're in the area of them. And then there's a number of types of grasses. Switchgrass can be a nice addition, and this would be more suited for a sunny rain garden location. Typically for grasses, you do want to have more of a sunny location, but it might be a good option to have, as a border or kind of edging for your rain garden. Or again, as we talked about, when you have those inflow areas and you're trying to break up the flow a little bit and kind of spread it around into the rain garden. So grasses can be a nice option for that location. So again, just a few other suggestions and these are plants that are a little bit better suited for shady areas. So there's the smooth hydrangea there on the left, elderberry, which is a nice one. That can get to be quite large. I do have one of those that I actually got from the seedling sale from the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. And just a plug for that, it is coming up. I think the seedling sale opens up next week for orders. So if you want to check out what they have, or Maria maybe can touch on that at the end. That's a great place to get a lot of plants, for maybe about $15. They're small seedlings, but they do eventually grow. And so I have an elderberry now that's probably about 15 feet tall from that seedling sale. You can see the the foam flower is another really nice one. I have some of those in my backyard, and it does very well in kind of the shady conditions. I also put turtle head on here, and that's one I've recently kind of added into my rain garden, and it does really well. And the nice thing with turtle head is that it actually blooms in like September and October, so it's a nice flower. You know, if you want to again try to look for more, you know, wide season interest, you know, there are as many flowers that bloom in the fall. You know, there's asters and some of the others, but turtle head is a nice addition, and it really does very well in wetter environments. And then ferns are a great option. There's a lot of really nice ferns, you know, for again, for more shady and damp areas. If you have more of a sunny location that you're looking at for your rain garden, you know, there's a lot of great options. Cardinal flower is a really lovely one, and that one does attract hummingbirds, so that can be nice entertainment, you know, for when you're enjoying your rain garden. Ironweed is a taller plant with kind of a bright pink flower, and then there's quite a number of types of milkweeds: the swamp milkweed, common milkweed, the butterfly weed, which is the smaller one with orange flowers, and then bee balms. There's a number of bee balms, different colors, pink and red, and again, those do well with in rain garden conditions. And then New England aster, that's another one I've planted kind of recently in my front yard, but it's really lovely in the fall. It has, you know, just a lovely New York, I think there's New England aster and also New York aster, just lovely purple color. And again, that's more of a fall blooming, so it's just a nice, you know, to have some plants that bloom in the fall. And then your several types of phlox, summer phlox, and some of the creeping phlox, some of the lower phloxes, those also thrive well in rain garden conditions. And then a few suggestions here, as we mentioned, for the inlets or the areas where you have a little bit more of your high energy flow. You can have sea oats, which is, you can see there on the left, and that has a really pretty tassel with the kind of the little seeds and you know, things hanging there on the stem, and so it's just a real nice aesthetic. You know, different type of choice. There's several types of grasses, blue stem, the soft rush, which I believe is the one kind of on the second from the left there. You could have sedges. Some of the sedges work very well in those environments where you have a little bit more of the flow. So if you had, for example, you know, a swale or something kind of coming into your rain garden, you know, the sedges can be a good choice there. And then also your blue flag iris there on the right can be great. And again, because those are a little sturdier when you have the higher flow environment. So what size of plants should you think about for your rain garden? So that's a good question. And so you know, some of it may depend on your budget as well, and how large of a rain garden you're planning, and how many plants you want to do. But if you have, you know, are a little bit patient, then you can consider the plugs. And so, you know, obviously those are smaller plants. You can see it in the picture there, kind of in the size of your hand. But you can often buy them in flats. So you might buy, you know, 30 or 40 of a particular plant. So if you want to buy some, and, you know, maybe you have some friends or some neighbors that wanted to share, you can do that. Or if you know you want to have, you know, a large area of sedge or something like that, then the plugs can be useful for that. And there are some, you know, a number of the places where you can order those plugs even just to be delivered to your house, which is convenient. So, and then if you want to have some larger plants, you can do the containers. They obviously are a little bit more gratifying in terms of your immediate impact of your planting. You will want to space them out a little bit more because those plants are a little bit larger. So the plugs, you know, you can plant a little bit closer together and they will kind of gradually fill in there. But the containers, you want to spread them out a little bit more. So just a few design tips. So I think someone, a well-known designer in our area, noted that, you know, if you have a well-designed rain garden, it's not necessarily obvious that it's a rain garden. So you know, may not necessarily want to just plunk it kind of right in the middle of your yard. But if you can kind of look at where you have any existing landscape beds, and, you know, for example, I think like one of the examples that Maria had earlier, where the woman, you know, added the rain garden as part of one of her existing beds, then it can sort of just expand, you know, that bed out and merge in with that. So then it may not be as obvious, you know, that that it's a rain garden, but it's possible if you, you know, maybe you want to kind of emphasize, you know, the function of it, and then that can be fun too, just to kind of put it right in front and center. So that might be a choice that you want to make. The rule of three, each plant should have at least 3 features that you enjoy. So that was what we were talking about a little earlier, you know, maybe with the fall color and the berries and the flowers that come out. So kind of looking for plants that have, you know, maybe more than just one aspect, so you can kind of enjoy them, you know, throughout the year. And it is a good idea to plant in kind of larger clumps. And this is something I know personally I've always had a challenge with. Sometimes I get, you know, I buy one of these plants and one of those plants, and then things can get a little bit more messy looking. So if you, as you're making your plant list, you know, think a little bit more carefully. And it does make it easier to maintain your garden, I think, when you have sort of larger groupings of your types of plants, since you don't have so many types of plants, because obviously as you go through the seasons in the spring, when the plants are coming back up, it's easier to kind of recognize, you know, a larger group of the same type of plant versus having one of these and 2 of those, and, you know, having more of a mix of all different types of plants. And so that can make it a little bit easier for your maintenance and kind of upkeep of your garden. So a good reminder to use the edges, and that can be somewhere where you can use a particular type of plant, for example, like a sedge or something, kind of to highlight the edge and sort of set that off and emphasize that. So let's drink real quick. You do want to plant densely, but you do need to remember the full size of your plants. And this is something I know even personally I have struggled with, because sometimes when you get, you know, these new young plants, they're just so small, and it's really hard to imagine that this plant is going to get to be 12 feet tall or 10 feet tall. And so that's something to keep in mind. Again, trying to put your bigger plants, you know, maybe towards the back or the sides, you know, so they're not blocking the view of some of the smaller plants. So thinking about the height and the shape and the size of the plants, but it can be a challenge sometimes. You can also move things, you know, around. That's one of the great things about gardening, is that you know, you're not necessarily building a fixed structure forever. You can, you know, divide and move things around and make adjustments. So. And we did talk about different seasonal interest with the plants, and also some variety and contrast can be fun. So you have maybe something that has a more spiky shape, you know, next to something with kind of a soft and rounder shape, and so those contrasts can be really interesting to enjoy. So if there are a lot of different rain garden templates available, and this is one website here at the Low Impact Development Center. They have some available on their website, a couple of the links here. So if it seems a little bit overwhelming to you to try to come up with a design, you can go on and look at some of these sample designs, and maybe you could, you know, modify it a little bit for your situation. But there are a lot of great designs that are out there, so you don't necessarily have to start, you know, totally from scratch. So again, just some more examples here of rain gardens and some of these design features. So you can see this is a nice rain garden, and they use the shape of the garden, kind of the this circle shape here to kind of mirror the walkway. So again, thinking of the, and then kind of going from the smaller plants up to the taller plants in the back, so that it can kind of just blend in with the forested area in the back there. And you can have, this is a rain garden that's adjacent to a parking lot, and so it's designed more sort of in a meadow kind of format, so using more of just your tall flowering plants. But you can, you know, you can use one, you know, type if you want to do more shrubs or more of your perennials. You know, here's a good example of that. So. All right, so I just have a little bit of information as well on maintenance, and then we can go back to answer some more questions. Excuse me. So for maintenance, and Maria touched on a little bit of this, obviously it is important when you first plant your rain garden to make sure that you are watering the plants. So we always remind everyone that just because it's a rain garden, it doesn't mean that it's a magic garden. So if you plant the rain garden and it hasn't rained for a little while, you do need to be watering those plants every week or two and kind of make sure that they're established. So if you, and sometimes that happens, it seems to be a given where you either have a huge storm or you plant the rain garden and then you don't get any rain for 2 months. So you do need to keep an eye on the weather and make sure that you are watering those plants, for the first 6 months, to a year, and kind of get them well established. And then after that point, they should again be able to survive well, even in dry periods. Another key point is observing rain garden, during a storm and then after a storm, and making sure that it's draining well, and you're not having that standing water for too long. Keeping an eye on the inflow and outflow areas, and if you do have a berm, on the berm, making sure that berm is nice and sturdy, and not starting to kind of come apart or break down in any areas. And then like other garden areas, weeding, you might have to replace plants, or you may find some volunteers that maybe you can move somewhere else. And then also adding some top layer of mulch, kind of like a little bit of wood mulch on the surface, if you want to do that too. So again, more for the short-term maintenance, as I mentioned, you do need to water the rain garden if it doesn't rain, especially for that first 6 months to a year. Observe the rain garden, yeah, and then some of these things we just discussed. So we'll jump ahead here. So here's an example of a rain garden that was put in at a condo, and this was very soon after it was installed. But you can see that, a big storm came through and it, was full of water there. And then this was the next day, had drained out. So again, just some examples of checking out. This is actually my backyard here, and you can see this is an area that I've converted into a rain garden. Just again, watching it during storms, see how it's filling up. So the inflow areas and outflow areas, you can see here, this is a rain garden that was installed in Falls Church, and you can see the downspouts from the house are being brought in. So just keeping an eye on this location, because obviously with 2 downspouts right there, you're going to have a decent amount of flow energy. You can see that they've put in some stones, to help again kind of break up that flow and slow it down a little bit, but just keeping an eye on how that's performing. This is a larger rain garden at the Fairlington Community Center, but it does have the inflow area in this location as well. So longer term maintenance, so we talked about mulching, keeping an eye on the berm. If you do have a berm, you're weeding, and also just monitoring your plants and replacing plants, maybe dividing and kind of moving them around as needed. So you can add, refresh the wood mulch layer on top of the garden, probably once a year. I don't know if you necessarily need to do it twice a year, but that really helps, control weeds and kind of, keep the garden, looking more tidy. And it does help. It does serve a function in terms of absorbing some of the pollutants as well from the garden. And now some of the mulch can move around a little bit, obviously, when you have water flowing through the rain gardens. So that's something you may need to kind of shift it around back into place. But it does help keep the garden, looking nice and kind of tidier. So here's that same garden I showed earlier. This one we had created a berm along the front of the rain garden. And so just again, keeping an eye on that. One advantage of a berm also, which I don't know that we've talked about, is if you are digging the garden yourself, if you don't necessarily have equipment that you're using, a berm can give you a little bit more ponding space without necessarily having to dig down quite as deep. So you may use it, as Maria was mentioning, when you have slope, differences in slope, but you can also use it to kind of give yourself a little bit more ponding area above the ground. So you can see here, this was a rain garden that my neighbor installed, and I think I just noticed it one day, I think when I was just walking the dogs, and I don't know why I ended up taking this picture because it was kind of just at the very beginning, but I noticed he was putting a lot of leaves here, and it started putting a few plants, and I was just like, oh, I wonder what, what's going on there. So, and then later on when I went by, I saw, oh yeah, it looks like he is kind of converting this into a rain garden. So you can see he created a flow path here, and then also created a nice berm at the front using some flagstones, and then has a little overflow pathway there. So this is, again, about when it was, newly installed. You can see there with its, holding some water. And then again, several years later when the plants have grown up quite a bit. So in terms of monitoring the plants, again, keep an eye on weeds, and this is where planting in larger clumps of the similar types of plants makes it easier to identify the weeds and remove those. And I find, especially in my yard, because it's a little, I have sort of a wooded backyard, it's a little bit more wild, than some yards. I often mark locations where I put in new plants, especially when they're very small, because otherwise I can very easily lose track of them and may not remember, exactly which plant that was. So that's something that I do myself. Replace plants, that maybe don't make it. And then we did talk about using the sturdier plants near the inflow. And then if the plants get larger and kind of fill in, you can potentially divide them. And then you may often find some volunteers. And so you can, if you want to keep that in that location, or you may be able to move that somewhere else in your yard. So this was my yard. This is our glamour shot, I guess. So this is when we moved in. This is probably about 10 years ago, but you can see we are the lucky beneficiaries of what we call OPW, or other people's water, which I'm sure some of you also experience. So this was obviously a very heavy rain, but we get water that just naturally kind of comes down. This area is kind of a lower point from several of the yards over here, and it flows down through here. So in this location, I decided to convert, over into a rain garden. So I dug it out some. I did not use a backhoe or anything like that. So I was kind of doing it more by hand. And then eventually, as this area fills up, the water kind of flows out around our house and out the other way. But you can see this is kind of the earlier stages. Whoop. And then at one point, we did have a little patio put in because there was an old kind of gravel walkway here, which had started to fall apart. And there was some wood edging and things that was kind of all rotting. So we had this new area installed. But one thing we did when we did that was these downspouts that you can see in the earlier picture, kind of downspouts coming out from the house. We had those buried under this area, and we put in these little pop-up emitters to kind of bring that water down into the rain garden. So you can see one of the downspouts comes out here, and one comes out over on this other side of the tree. But these are a nice way if you do have downspouts, you don't necessarily want to have a pipe extending out into your rain garden. You can, if you have a good slope direction, you can bury those and use these little pop-up emitters to bring the water into your rain garden. So this is the rain garden probably a couple years ago. You can see a lot of the different plants in here. This is the turtle head I mentioned. We had quite a few hosta kind of existing here already. This is a coneflower, a yellow coneflower. This is the elderberry. This is Amsonia, which I have a couple of those. Those are nice. And then we have a lot of, different ginger. And then I think I have a Joe Pye weed over here. This is also a Joe Pye weed, which is a little bit hard to see there. But anyway, it's filled in quite a bit. And then, we did have English ivy also in the yard, which I had pulled out a lot of. But when we took that out, this is Virginia creeper, which was there. And so I ended up just keeping that because that is a native plant. So just a few more examples. I'll keep an eye on the time here. I have about 10 minutes left. So this was a, excuse me. A townhouse in Arlington that had some drainage problems. And so you can see here they had just a lot of bare soil, and it was a very shady area under the trees. And so they did a project to do some conservation landscaping and also installed kind of a tiered rain garden that you can see coming down in this location. So just some different examples of projects that have been done. Here's some other rain garden projects. This was a homeowner in Arlington. Again, this was a master gardener, and she had kind of a shade garden, but she wanted to convert. She was getting a fair amount of runoff from her neighbor, and so she ended up bringing the runoff kind of down in this area and into the rain garden in this back part of her yard. Same with this homeowner here. They had a lot of area kind of in the back of the yard where water would pool and collect for a little while, so they ended up putting in this rain garden, kind of a little bit more front area, but you can see the sweet spires there, and they put in a river birch, which is a nice, really nice tree that you can also use in a rain garden. This is a more recent project, but this homeowner as well got a lot of drainage coming kind of down the side of her yard, and so she converted that area into a rain garden. You can see this is one of the bee balm, one of the types of bee balms that does well. And then here we do also have another homeowner who had, because of kind of the slope, you can see that the yards up here are uphill. She was receiving runoff, again, from those uphill areas. And so she installed a couple rain gardens, but one of the first one was here by the fence. So taking in some of that drainage and slowing it down. This is a condo at the Fairlington Villages, and so they have been installing a number of rain gardens, but here's one that you can see. And they incorporated, there was a storm drain there, so they kind of incorporated the storm drain as part of the new rain garden. And this is just a nice rain garden. This is near Washington College, which is actually in Maryland, but it's near where my parents live, so I drive by it sometimes. But this is a nice example of a rain garden using just a big mass planting of one type of plant, but that's a Joe Pye weed. And so you can see, obviously, when the Joe Pye weed is blooming, it's a very, very lovely example of a rain garden. I think, Maria, did you want to touch on the VCAP information?
Sure. Let me start. So I can go back to the very last slide I had, but we had some lists, listservs at the bottom if you wanted to add yourself to in Fairfax County and across the state of Virginia. Most of the state of Virginia, there is a program called the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. This is a watershed-based cost share program to incentivize homeowners to do conservation techniques. So things like larger sized rain barrels are called cisterns, or rain gardens, or like we talked about, the larger size, they're called a bioretention or an infiltration trench. There's all different types of practices. So for rain gardens in particular, cost shares grants can be up to $3,500. And subject to statewide fund availability, we say this is a statewide competition for funds because proposals get reviewed at our local level and then we send them to the state. So we run our program here in Northern Virginia on an annual basis. So if you did want to jump on that waitlist for the notification for the site visit application period, it will be this coming July 2021. So I think I can go find that link and maybe put it in the chat real quickly. And again, other practices, like we said, the cisterns and other larger things can be considered as well. I think the next slide.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. And just some links that we had up previously for more information. We've got our conservation district at fairfaxcounty.gov, and this is the program page on our local website for the Conservation Assistance Program. So there's also a state page that you might land on if you look up the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. Each district runs the program a little bit differently, so there's great resources on the state, but please do pay attention for specific timelines and dates and ask us here at the local level with our Fairfax County. All right, I think, Eileen, are you wrapped up with your slides?
Yep. Yeah, I was just looking through
Okay.
questions. It looked like Corey had answered a lot of the questions.
Yeah, we have
Oh, sorry.
a few questions. If we have time for a quick discussion.
Sure.
Let's see. What do you do if you notice lots of standing water after a rain?
Maybe. Oh, do you
Sure.
want me to take that?
Yeah, I'll go, and then if you want to add anything,
Okay.
feel free. If you notice a lot of standing water, right after a rain in your rain garden, then you can just kind of pat yourself on the back, because that's, that's the goal. You want the rain garden to collect some of the water and then ideally let it soak in. So if it's gets to be more than like 2 days after a rain and you still have standing water in your rain garden, then that's when, you may have an issue. But that's why, as Maria talked about with the design, you want to do your infiltration testing and everything ahead of time, so that you don't kind of get to that situation, because hopefully you want to make sure that, the rain garden is going to be able to soak in a lot of that water, and you won't have it, standing there for more than a day or so.
All right. Let's see. Another great question. Can a rain garden have too many plants?
I think, with any kind of a landscaped area, it can get too full. I mean, then the plants, I guess, they'll sort of manage themselves. I mean, if they are feeling too crowded, they're not going to be necessarily spreading as much, or, making volunteers or anything like that. But I think it's some of it's sort of your aesthetic choice. Like, some people prefer to have the plants a little bit more spread out, and maybe be able to see the mulch, layer, like you saw with some of our pictures. My rain garden in the back, because of we have that Virginia creeper, that kind of just naturally grows in there. I sort of leave that as like a ground cover, and then the other plants grow up through that. So it does look very, full and sort of grown in, as compared with some rain gardens. So I think some of that is a matter of your preference, but you can always, if your plants are doing really well and very happy, you can always split them and kind of divide them and move them into other locations, or, if you have extras, give them to some friends or something like that too.
I threw in a link there, Corey. I'm not sure if it goes automatically to everybody or if you have to send it, but it's that notification list that folks can sign themselves up for.
I'll put it in the chat here. For some reason, it only allows you to send to the presenters.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I don't know why.
Yeah, I noticed that too. We don't have the choice to send to everybody.
Another question. Okay, so with native plants, I thought that part of the point was that they were well adapted to local rainfall levels, but you still need to water them.
Yes, and this is just when they're getting established. So as I mentioned, when you're establishing any type of a plant, trees, any shrubs, anything like that, as it's, when you first put it in, the roots are not, kind of as deep and dug down into the soil as they will be eventually, as it grows in. So you do need to keep an eye. Now, if it's raining regularly, when you put in your rain garden and then it's, it's raining pretty regularly, that'll.
Oh no, she froze.
Mm.
Eileen, you froze.
Tend to have the dry
Oh.
periods as much, you know,
There
getting
she
into.
goes.
So,
You froze up here for a little bit there.
oh, did I drop off? Sorry about that.
No, you just kind of
So,
froze.
yeah, oh, I froze. Okay. Yeah.
Let's
So
see.
fall can be a great time to install a rain garden because then the plants have, you know, that winter period, you know, to kind of, you know, continue getting comfortable before, you know, and then they have spring before it gets into kind of the heat of the summer. If you install your rain garden in the spring, you know, it's going to be, you're potentially going to have those hot, dry periods, you know, sooner. So it's just something you need to keep an eye on, make sure if it's raining regularly.
And we have one more question. Somebody asked if you could go back to the first slide on plant choices.
Sure. Let's see if I can just, oh. The Winterberry, is that the one or?
Maybe go back one more.
Okay. That was the natives and
Oh,
invasives.
okay.
Or
Yep.
do they mean the, do they mean these summary lists, the shade plants and?
Maybe that one.
Okay. And just as a reminder, we will be posting these slides as well. So hopefully we'll be able to get them pretty quickly.
Well, I think we've reached our time limit here. So, and I don't see any other questions. So I guess we can wrap it up here. I'm going to go ahead and post this recording on a YouTube channel, and I will send that link out to all the people that registered. And then I also send the link out to the website where you can find links to these pages or these presentations. So if there's no other questions, I think we can end it here. Oh, just a comment.
Okay.
This was excellent information. Many thanks.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah. We're glad you got to spend part of this gloomy Friday afternoon with us.